Welcome to today's seminar, Collective Impact, 3 Tools and Techniques. My name is Kirsty Batista, and I'm the community animator for the Tamarack Communities Collaborating Learning Community. Probably know a few of you on the line today. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to start off by introducing our guest presenters who will be sharing information about a collective impact tool or technique today. First, we have Tom Klaus on the line, who will be filling us in about the roots to fruits of sustainable community change approach. Tom has a PhD in organizational leadership and is a practitioner of social profit organizational leadership with extensive experience with social profit organizations in theory, including collective impact. Tom is a social profit business and leadership development consultant based in Laurel, Maryland, and an adjunct professor at Eastern University in the School of Leadership Development. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Kirsty. Glad to be here.
Okay, our second guest presenter is Kirby Edmonds, who will be telling us about the problem identification tool. Kirby Edmonds is the managing partner of TFC Associates, a human relations training and consulting firm based in Ithaca, New York. He's also a senior fellow and program coordinator for the Dorothy Cotton Institute, a project of the Center for Transformative Action. Kirby has several years of experience working on diversity in corporate, higher education, and public school environments. Kirby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
Lovely. And our third guest presenter is Russ Gaskin, who will be explaining to us the key initiator approach. And Russ is a consultant and mentor and speaks and works around the world on social innovation, human-centered design, and leveraging diversity as a source of strategic innovation. Russ's firm, Co-Creative, specializes in developing collective impact networks to solve complex problems like revitalizing distressed communities, rebuilding non-GMO food supply chains, and designing the labor union for the future. He was recently named to the UN Development Program's panel on social innovation and design. Hi, Russ. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today as well.
Hi, Kirsty. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here.
Alrighty, so we've got an hour. The webinar will go till 2 Eastern time. I think we should just get started. So each presenter is going to have about 15 minutes or so to tell us about their tool. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to take all of the questions at the end. So please use the chat box to ask your questions, and we'll be announcing them out loud for our presenters to respond to, as you are going to remain on mute for the duration of the call since we are recording today. All right, Tom, do you want to start us off with the Roots to Fruit of Sustainable Community Change tool?
I am happy to, Kirsty, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and the good folks that are part of this webinar, and especially with Kirby and Russ. I'm really looking forward to sharing this time with them and learning from them as well. So, the Roots to Fruit of Sustainable Community Change is a framework an approach to long-term community change that I created with my collaborator, Dr. Ed Saunders from the University of Iowa School of Social Work. It's an integrated framework. Our original contribution to this was of naming the 4 stages of community transition that you see up in the tree of the model in front of you. Now, I realize that some of the wording up there is a little bit small. Some of the fonts are a little bit small and it may be a little challenging to read, but you will be getting this as a slide later, and so you'll be able to look at it a little bit more closely. The other components of the framework actually draw upon other theoretical models and frameworks to explain the conditions necessary to either create or sustain the conditions of community change. Among these include a psychosocial model of community readiness, and we think of community readiness in this model as being represented by the soil that the roots of the tree sit under. The collective impact framework is to be found under the leadership backbone, and as you go through that down the list of the different components of the leadership backbone in this particular framework, you'll notice that there are the conditions, the classic conditions of collective impact, but there's also a couple of others that we have added along the way that we'll talk about after a bit. Dynamic governance and sociocracy. is a theoretical understanding that we have built into community participation and governance of the leadership backbone. The Tamarack model for community engagement informs the community conversations and other community engagement activities that you find in the trunk of the tree going up into the fruit. It's the piece that connects the fruit to the roots, if you will, of the model. And then that interplay between the community engagement activities with the community transition stages is somewhat informed by Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory. And then finally, complexity theory has informed the implementation or animation of the Roots to Fruit framework. Well, speaking of animating it, we are currently animating the framework through a nested backbone structure in a Midwestern state in the United States. The way this is working is that we have 19 community-based grantees, each of which has to have at least one coalition. And there are several grantees actually that have 2 and 3 community coalitions given the geographic area that they are trying to cover. And so we are working with those backbone coalitions to help them address 5 key questions that are related to the core ideas of the framework that will lead them through the Roots to Fruit to achieve a level of community ownership of the project or initiative that they're undertaking, and then create also the support for the desired community change that they're working on. Now, the way that we're doing this is that we're providing training and guidance and technical support by working with 5 peer coaches who are selected from among the grantees in this project, and they are in turn taught to coach 2 or 3 other grantees in the project, so that we are not only giving out the training and the technical assistance that the different coalitions need to accomplish the work in their communities, but we are also creating some sustainability of the process going forward in the state by training these additional people that can in the future continue this work forward. So the model also has, the framework also has this aspect of the internal processes and the external processes. We think of the internal processes as being the roots and the soil, and the external as being represented by the trunk and the fruit. And so, Amy, if you'll go to the next slide. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about the internal processes. These are focused on establishing a high-performing local backbone coalition. At least in the project that we're currently working on in the Midwest, we are referring to this group as a backbone, the leadership backbone as a backbone coalition. So the degree to which we are successful in establishing a really strong root system below the surface there is the degree to which we are able to affect some long-term community change that is shown in impacts in policy and practice, social attitudes, and also behavior within the community. So in terms of the leadership backbone, there are some pieces that is really important for them to kind of pull together. One is this understanding of the readiness of the community to change. Without that sense of readiness, that the community is at a place where it's ready to move forward and to examine the issue that is under question. Unless the community is really ready for that, a lot of effort could be expended without a whole lot of results. The leadership backbone is also responsible as well for paying attention to community participation. Now, those of you that were at the Collective Impact Summit in Toronto, you were introduced to a couple of new terms that as I have used them with groups since October have just resonated in a very significant way. And those terms are context experts and content experts. And so what we know about context experts is that these are the folks who know about the lived experience of the issue that we're attempting to address through a community change initiative. The content experts, on the other hand, are people who have a certain know-how about solving challenging problems. So for many of us that are on this line today, we are really those content experts. We have certain expertise that we can bring to solving complex community challenges and problems. And many times when we form leadership backbones, when we form these groups that are going to facilitate the change, we really focus on bringing together more people like us, the content experts. And I think one of the most stunning things that I heard Brenda Zimmerman talk about at the Collective Impact Summit was this idea that if in fact we were going to be successful in engaging context experts, we need to have approximately 50% of the people that were in our decision-making groups to be context experts. I have since in a couple of settings had the opportunity to see this in play, and it is incredibly powerful when you bring that many voices to the table of context experts. So one of the tasks of the leadership backbone is really to pay attention to community participation, the diversity of that group, as well as the balance between the context experts and the content experts. And then, of course, the leadership backbone creates the 5 conditions of collective impact that we see listed there under number 2, leadership backbone. But there's a couple of other pieces that they have to give attention to. One is that the leadership backbone needs to give attention to providing clear leadership in the community engagement activities. And they also have to give attention to using inclusive decision-making strategies that ensure the equity and equality of voices, especially in achieving that balance between the context and the content experts. And then, of course, one of the things that the leadership backbone is responsible for doing is leading those community conversations and other community engagement activities that we hear so much about from the Tamarack folks. So the internal processes provide this foundation and support, this deep root system for the external processes that lead to community transition. And of course, there's a process down there very deep in the root system we haven't talked about yet, but we will, which is this idea of continuous quality improvement. Through regular, frequent, and intensive high-quality community conversations and other community engagement activities, we are successful in raising awareness of and educating about the issue that we're trying to address in a community. And this is a significant part of laying that foundation upon which transition can occur. Now, what happens is, going up the tree, if you follow the arrows, you'll note that the more effective we become in awareness and education and creating these conversations that lead to some kind of general agreement about how we address the issue, what happens is that the leadership backbone becomes known as the go-to authority on that particular issue, and so they are legitimized in the eyes of the community, and this legitimacy becomes a leverage point where they are able to they're able to access even more people and perhaps even to access some resources that heretofore have been unavailable to them. We'd like to suggest that somewhere between the legitimization stage and the transformation stage is that tipping point, where there is this widespread growth of understanding about the issue and about how to address it and what needs to take place, to the point where the gatekeepers many gatekeepers of resources, whether that's time or funding or other kinds of resources, and particularly those who may have been resistant or late adopters even to the process and to the work, they finally come on board because there is this, groundswell of support within the community that they can no longer ignore, and they need now to pay attention to. So that's the transformation stage, that legitimized expertise that's been built by the leadership backbone is now leveraged to gain resources and access that might not have been available up to that point, because the gatekeepers of those things were standing back looking and saying, not really sure where this thing is going. I don't really know if it has traction. I need to take a wait and see attitude. When we move towards normalization, what has happened by this point in time is that the word is really caught, and to a certain extent, this new norm has gone viral, this new norm about how we're addressing this particular issue. By the way, I want to take a step back for a second and just kind of pose this question for you to think about. How do you know when an issue that you're working on to try to change, a change that you're trying to facilitate in a community has actually been attained, when normalization and adoption of that has been attained? I generally find you know it in this way. When you ask people, how is it that you have come to work with homeless people in this way? Or how is it that you have come to address poverty in this way? Or how is it that you've come to address teen pregnancy in this way? The people will respond with this answer: we've always done it that way. And when they begin to respond in that way, it tells me that there is a level of normalization that's taken place, because now they cannot even remember the days before. So that's at least anecdotally and qualitatively, that's one of those signposts to look for with people when you know that you're really beginning to make an impact in a community. So the community transition then at the very top of the model there, it leads ultimately to policy and practice change, social attitude, and behavioral change. But if you'll notice on the side of the model, there's two arrows, one on the left going up and one on the right going down. And what that says to us is that this is a repetitive, continuous process that we are always becoming better at community participation, becoming better at creating an effective leadership backbone, better at becoming doing community conversations and community engagement work and so on. And one of the ways that happens is because of that number 5 at the bottom, which is continuous quality improvement, that we're constantly looking at how it is that we're doing and finding ways to improve upon that. Now, we've piloted an evaluation of this framework already, but in early 2015, we're going to be doing the first wave of an annual evaluation with the 19 sites to both study and monitor the process of community change. Go ahead and change the slide there, Amy. And I've got about 2 minutes left, and I think I can do that very easily. So the roots to fruit tools that are available at this point, one is the self-assessment that's currently available free upon request, and if you shoot me an email, I'll be happy to send that out to you. Coming in January, because it is so late already in 2014, is going to be a roots to fruit tailored implementation, instruction, and training. And then go ahead to the next slide, Amy. Also in 2015, by spring, we are going to be able, I believe, to make the online evaluation survey and analysis available to groups that are interested in using it. It can be used as a standalone to assess your process of community change within the community. It can be used in conjunction with the Roots to Fruit model as well. So a word about the survey. It's online. It's completed by individual members of the leadership backbones. It uses 8 scales. The measures on the existing survey were informed by some existing measures, but all are original for this tool. The scales have strong reliability in previous pilots, and the individual measures also have been shown to have strong face validity. And there's my contact information below, and I'm going to pass it back to Kirsty.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that wonderful overview of the Roots to Fruit tool. Just as a reminder, we are recording the call, and we are going to send the recording out, so you'll have that in a follow-up email along with these slides. I had a few questions about the slides. You will be receiving a copy for yourself via email. Just if you have any questions about Tom's tool, please type them into the chat box now, and we'll be addressing them later in the webinar. And to keep things moving along, we now have Kirby Edmonds, who will be presenting the problem identification tool.
So one of the things for those who were at the Tamarack conference, John Kanye said to us the importance of getting the right eyes on the problem and getting a deep understanding of the problem. And this is a really simple tool for both getting an understanding of the problem and also perhaps identifying quick wins. So the goal is to ask people in relation to whatever problem they're trying to work on. It could be how are we doing as a team. It could be how's our collaboration going? It could be how are we doing with poverty? It could be something really simple or something really complex. What's going well? And then to list as many things as people can think of that are going well, and then also ask them to list what's going poorly. And as they list those things, then to ask them to divide those lists into two categories. One is the things that are firm or relatively fixed that aren't likely to change, and the other is the list of things that are changeable, relatively malleable. And what you end up with then is a 4-quadrant grid that has the things that are firm or fixed that are going well are your assets, things that you can pretty much count on that give you support. Things that are going well that are relatively changeable are the things that really need maintenance to keep paying attention to keeping them going well. Things that are going poorly that cannot change are constraints or disasters. If you think about an earthquake, for example, once it's happened, you can't undo it. It's pretty bad, and you do what you can to adjust to it, but it's not going away. Things that are going poorly that are changeable then become the problem areas. Now, when I'm working on this tool, I ask people to start with what's going well to push against the tendency of people to turn their attention to the constraints or disasters. So if we could just get one more click here. When people do that, what happens is they dissipate their energy. In a room, people tend to want to talk about the things that they can't do anything about. And so by starting with what's going well, you're actually reversing that trend and getting people to pay more attention to their assets, the things that need maintenance, the things that are really going well for them. So now you've got this list of problems up in the right-hand corner of the quadrant there. So if we go to the next slide, there are a few things that you can do around sorting the problem. There's a fast way to do it, which is to ask people as a show of hands which are the problems that everybody thinks are really important to do something about, or you can do it with dots. You can also do a more deliberative process that use criteria such as the importance of the problem, the urgency, which is how quickly it needs to be addressed in order to get anything done with it, the cost, or its difficulty. And for this, I use a scoring system. In groups that I work with where we haven't had a lot of time up front, I generally use importance, urgency, and difficulty. And there's a scoring system where the things that are really important, for example, get a 3. The things that are less important get a 1. Things that are most urgent get a 3. That are least urgent get a 1. And here's the tricky part. Things that are most difficult get a 1, and least difficult get a 3. And if you do the math in your head, if something's really important, it gets a 3. Really urgent, it gets a 3. And really easy, it gets a 3. And so you get out of that list of problems a score. If you're using 3, you would have 9. If you're using 4, you'd have 16. That basically scores things in those terms. So around the issue of quick wins, if you have problems that have gotten a high number, those would be the things that you might start on first because they're relatively easier to do something about, they're relatively urgent, and they're relatively important. So we can go on to the next slide. So the advantage of this kind of process is that it's really simple to use. It can engage a lot of different people. You can have a problem that is very simple or a problem that's really complex, so it's flexible in that sense. It's also flexible in terms of the time required. So even with a large group, you can do a process like this in 1 to 3 hours. If you really want to try to get a plan out of it with some action steps and some assignments, you can spend as much as 1 to 2 days and get a very thorough plan. I've used this process for doing strategic planning with groups to identify priorities. Another advantage is that it's really engaging. So you can have small groups work on particular problems. You can have small groups work on a particular quadrant and get more understanding of that. If you think about that 4 quadrant grid. The other thing is it's not important that everybody agree on where a particular item goes, so that some people might think about some issue as a constraint and somebody else thinks of it as an asset, and that becomes a place for people to converse with each other about their different perspectives. And another really advantage is it really turns people's attention to what they can do something about. So that's it for this tool. It also really establishes priorities for improvement, and by priority it's not so much what's most important, although it does that as well if you use those criteria I talked about, but really what we want to work on first, what we can actually make progress with quickly, as well as beginning to identify things that may take more planning and more time. So that's it.
Perfect. Actually, we had a quick question, Kirby, from Jane Caldwell. She's asking if you could explain the fast-way dots.
Well, if you have sticky dots and you've got a list of problems and you don't have a lot of time, you can give dots to participants and ask them to go put their dots next to the problems that they think are, and then you fill in the blank, either the most important to work on, or the one that they have the most energy to work on, or the one that's easiest to work on, however, whatever criterion you want people to use, and then people put their dots next to the problem, and then you count dots. And so the dots that the problems that get the most dots might be the one that you then turn the group's attention to, thinking about what they might want to do.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's a wonderful tool. It could be used in a variety of scenarios. Thanks so much, Kirby, for telling us more about the problem identification tool. And moving on to our last collective impact tool, we have Russ, and he's going to tell us about the key initiator approach.
Hi, everybody. I'm in Washington, D.C. today, where it's disturbingly warm. Not that I'm complaining too much. I'm going to share this, how we choose people in a key initiator working group, and some of the principles that we use in those groups. We also have two other P's related to key initiator, the process that we use, and what I call the practicalities, which is basically the only P word I could find for tools. But, so I'm not going to talk about the process and the practicalities today, but I'm happy to share resources. We have lots of tool worksheets and things like that I'm happy to put on the website and share. So key initiator networks were pioneered by a woman named Susan Davis back in the 1980s, and we've built on what she did and have worked with her over time to kind of flesh out how we select the people for participating in these groups, the principles that we use, et cetera. These are some of the examples of ones that I've worked on, and as you can see, many of these are industry or market-oriented. Solar Circle, Better Paper, Non-GMO Supply, Clean Electronics Production, which is in development right now. And that's my background. I haven't actually worked for a corporation, but I've worked with corporations on sustainability, equity, and inclusion for about 22 years. So that's the history of Key Initiator primarily. We are applying it now at the community level, and particularly we're engaged with a partner called ThinkPlace in Auckland, New Zealand, on the Southern Initiative, which is a community revitalization initiative that actually grew out of a government, city council-led effort to do economic and workforce and sector development in South Auckland, New Zealand. And they found after spending a lot of money in several years that they weren't getting engagement or traction on the issues, and the community was in fact becoming increasingly frustrated with their belief that the city council was doing things to them, not with them, and not supporting their priorities. And so we were asked to join ThinkPlace and bring a collective impact approach. So we've applied the Key Initiator approach and recreated what we call the operating model for the Southern Initiative based on this Key Initiator approach. So what's happened, we're at the point now where we've farmed around the operating model, and the energy level and engagement and enthusiasm has multiplied dramatically just in the course of a couple of months without actually having really done anything other than to talk about the new approach, the new way of doing things, and what the operating model would be for a new Southern initiative. So that shows some of the power of just reframing how we're going to go about doing this work together. Another example, a great story from the first collective impact project that I did is the one up in the top left called Community Capital. In 1998, I was managing a trade association here in the U.S. called the Social Investment Forum. And these are financial institutions and professionals who invest according to social values. And we had a lot of members of the Social Investment Forum who are what we call community development financial institutions. So these are banks, credit unions, loan funds that invest in low-income communities. And they were reporting to us that because of the economics at the time, especially related to dot-com boom and institutional investing practices, that they were severely short of capital. They had a lot more demand and need for capital for things like microenterprise development, affordable housing, child care services, things like that, than they had capital available. So we first looked at the government because there was a CDFI fund in the U.S. federal government. And after talking to the folks there, we knew that we weren't going to get any significant increase in the appropriations for the CDFI fund. So then we actually looked around and basically we did a simple thing. We just looked for really big pots of money. And it didn't take long for us to settle on the mutual fund industry, which in 1998 had about $7.2 trillion in assets under management. So we kind of figured naively, all right, but if we can get a little tiny percent of $7.2 trillion, then that'll meet our needs. So of course the question was how to do this. So we convened a group that included some folks from the CDFI community. We included some money managers, some mutual fund portfolio managers, institutional investors, high net worth individuals, family offices, trusts, et cetera. And we brought folks into the room and basically said, okay, we need $1 billion. How do we get it from there to here? And so they went out and started using what we call experiential interviews or ethnographic interviews, where they just went and they started talking to fund managers about their experience in trying to invest in these kinds of products. And the first thing we discovered when we sat down, literally sat down with one of the managers, was that she did trades on a computer terminal. So when she wanted to buy a security or let go of a security, it was a matter of click, 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 and it was done. Contrast that with investing in these CDFIs. She had to call her controller, have the controller open an account, move cash, do a cash transfer of $50,000 or $100,000 into the CDFI, and then if she wanted to trade back out at some point to get more money out of cash and into securities, they would have to do this whole manual process again. So we realized that the solution to that was to get these, was to make these bank products and loan fund products tradable. So about 18 months of work, we got DTIC codes and we got them listed on the Schwab trading platform. And so the group solved for that problem in 18 months. The other thing we discovered was that they were concerned, of course, about performance. So we had a person, a portfolio analysis expert, run portfolio simulations that demonstrated that the performance impact of putting some of their cash into these community investment products was negligible. No money manager would care about the impact of doing that. And so that removed the second barrier. And of course, the third piece was they said, well, but why would we do this? And so the group came up with this idea and created what a campaign we called 1% for Communities. 1% for Communities was a way to recognize and promote in media, in investing magazines, in personal finance magazines, mutual funds that would agree to allocate 1% of their portfolios to rebuilding American communities. And so it was free differentiation, it was free brand building, it was building a lot of goodwill for some of these, in some cases, very large funds, and it was a way to differentiate themselves in a very competitive market. And so we got a number of funds, including some large ones, to sign up, and in about 3 years from when we launched the group, we had moved $3.2 billion into CDFIs. And so the government CDFI fund here, in 20 years of operation, has distributed about $1.7 billion. So we were able to double what the CDFI fund did in just 3 years by convening the right people to look at the problem, to set a goal that seemed unachievable at the time, but in fact turned out to be really relatively easily achievable. Next. So there are some situations where the key initiator approach works particularly well relative to other approaches, and some of these you'll recognize as system problems where collective impact in general would apply. So number one, we look at situations where the problem is chronic and previous attempts to solve it have failed, like with the Southern Initiative in South Auckland. We look for situations where stakeholders have divergent worldviews, and they even have different ways of thinking about or defining the problem. In some cases, we have people participating that don't even think that what we think is a problem, and I'll say more about that in a bit. Next, this works really well where the system is complex, and no one person has a view of the whole problem. And in fact, we select for people who don't believe that they have a view of the whole problem, that they know that they need others to get the full perspective on the situation. It works well where the system is fragmented, and especially when we do market work or supply chain work, often there's an incredible lack of communication and coordination. So now we're bringing together electronics manufacturers with electronics brands, and they're communicating really deeply about the systemic problems that result in workers getting exposed to toxic emissions and things like that. Next, it works well where the system, this is interesting, it's like the system is paradoxically dynamic. Like there's a lot of energy and stuff happening, and some of the energy is really negative, people are complaining or whatever, but there's no forward movement. And that to us indicates that there's energy for change, which we can capitalize on. And then finally, it works well where there's at least some level of anticipation among some stakeholders that new, more full, more complete solutions are possible, but they have no idea what they are. And so that's often a symptom of the fact that we've got different people seeing different parts of the problem, but no one getting a view of the whole system. Next. So these are the qualities we look for in the people that we tend to invite into our working groups. And when you get closer to community level projects, oftentimes you feel like, well, we don't have as much discretion about who we're going to invite in. One of the things I'll say in our experience is that often the right people are not the executive director or the CEO or even the top expert on whatever issue it is that we're trying to address. It's people who have these qualities. So the way I'm presenting these is on the left, I'm sharing the characteristic that we look for. And part of our process is that before we launch any working group, we spend about 9 months interviewing between 120 and 200 stakeholders in the system. And part of what we're doing, half of what we're doing in that process is very carefully and intentionally looking for the people who hold these qualities. On the right, I'm sharing the polarity that they seem to leverage well. What I mean by polarity is if you, for example, found somebody with lots of confidence but no humility, you can imagine how that person is going to show up in the group. On the other hand, if you find someone with lots of humility and no confidence, you can also imagine how that person will show up in the group. So we found that each of these characteristics is actually related to the person's ability to really leverage and express these polarity pairs well. So the first one, people who are held in high regard by their peers tend to have disproportionate influence among their constituents. And this applies both to content experts and context experts. So we have a poverty working group in development here in the U.S., and we're looking for people who are literally living in poverty and who are respected by folks who are working in poverty issues and other folks who are living in poverty. We look for people who have high expertise in their part of the system or value chain. As you see there, the polarity for that, we believe, is expertise and ignorance. Everyone is expert in some part of the issue, whether it's the experience of being poor or globalization as a contributor to poverty, and yet because the system is so large and complex, we get the fresh perspective, the beginner's mind in the system as well. Proven collaboration abilities is another. You've all been in meetings or processes where you have 40 people, one person can't collaborate, and it undermines the whole process. We look for people who are analytical and action-oriented at the same time, or willing to be. People who are able to represent their institution's involvement. That's not necessarily the most senior people, but they're people who are respected back in their home organizations. And finally, we look for 90% of the participants to be 100% committed to the goal. But we want to include some skeptics who don't believe that what we're trying to do is possible, but they're willing to be convinced. And the reason we do that is because groups can always sell themselves stories, right? And the skeptics keep us honest and test our assumptions. Next. So finally, these are some key initiator principles. This list was started by Susan back in the 80s, and then we've developed it over time. Her core principle is that a deal is a good deal when it's good for all concerned. And so things that we're doing in the group, we're not looking for consensus on everything we do. Sometimes in our groups, a few people will go off and do a side project that the group is okay with. But when the group is looking for what's a solution or a way forward on the problem that we're facing, this is the principle that we're operating from. Second, this one's important to Susan as well. Each member does what she loves to do, does uniquely well, and does as little else as possible. And that's how we maintain energy and commitment and momentum over time. We focus on building trust, building collective intelligence, and building momentum, which we also say is kind of head, heart, and hands. We use the lean process in some of our work, basically analyzing the problem really quickly, literally in the first meeting, mapping the system, and beginning prototyping of solutions, because we believe we learn more from the prototypes than we do from hours of analysis and discussion. And then next is everything is a hypothesis. So even if when we launch a group, we start with what we call a draft or a working goal. And we're open to that changing because we want not just the hypotheses to be tested, but for the goal itself to be tested over time. And then finally, differentiate before integrate and leverage tensions has to do with how we work with differences in the group. We actually position them as sources of innovation and platforms on which we can build trust, rather than differences being or resistance being problems for us. We see them as resources for innovation and deepening engagement. That's it.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you, everyone. That concludes the presentation component of today's webinar. Tom presented on the Roots to Fruits tool for sustainable community change. Kirby Edmonds presented on the problem identification tool, and Russ, thank you for telling us more about the key initiator approach. We have about 15 minutes left in the webinar, and we can move now into the Q&A portion of the call. Because we are recording the call, we're going to keep you on mute, so we'll encourage you to ask your questions through the questions box, and I'll announce them out loud for our presenters to respond to. I do see a question here from Jane Caldwell for you, Russ, and she asks, how do you establish what the shared objective is in order to form the best group of key initiators? Hit and miss, or focus prior to approaching?
So in the lead up to the launch meeting, where we spend about 9 months interviewing stakeholders, we do 3 things in that part of the process. One is the stakeholder identification according to those attributes I described. Second is we're actually testing the goal iteratively throughout that process. So we create at the beginning what we call a frame up, and that has our hypothesis of what the goal would be, and it has our hypotheses about what the barriers and the emerging opportunities are. So as we're talking to people, we iterate between the goal and the definition of the problem and opportunity, as well as who we would be inviting. So by the time we get to the launch meeting, we've got the right goal for the right people, at least generally, and of course being open to learning as we go forward from there. But usually that's refining the goal that we started with after the launch meeting, not fundamentally changing it.
Jane says, thank you. We have a question here from Krista, and she asks, what are some examples of engaging the context experts in a community? And Krista, is that question for Russ? Krista says yes, that one's for you, Russ.
Okay. So we've been working for the past year with a working group on rebuilding non-GMO, non-genetically modified corn and soy production in the U.S. And we've launched 2 initiatives. By the way, we call our big group the working group, and the small things that come out of it initiatives, which I think is different from FSG. But we have 2 big initiatives that have come out, one around feed for dairy and feed for meat production. And we've created basically smaller working groups in dairy, for example. And there, the change that we're trying to inflect is to ask farmers who are growing grains to transition to non-GMO, which is basically for some of them, they're thinking, well, gee, I stopped doing that 20 years ago. Why would I go back to it? Because the genetically modified production systems are so much easier for them. And so we've actually brought farmers and dairy and grain farmers into the working group. We usually would charge fees for the companies, but we're actually paying farmers to show up. Some of them have made a transition to non-GMO production and others haven't. And some of them are actually opposed to what we're doing. And so it becomes very tricky to facilitate, and that's where we draw on our processes and our practicalities and our tools. But when we're asking someone to change their behavior, anyone in the system to change their behavior, we believe that they have to be in the group because we need to understand the context in which we're asking them to do this. In the poverty group, it's very different dynamic, as you can imagine, to have people, both homeless people and working poor, in a working group with other people who are, in contrast to them, relatively well educated and sophisticated about the issues. And I can share more materials about how we do that. I'm happy to do that if you'd like to connect with me.
Russ, you raised a really good point there about a particular challenge in the situation that you were talking about with the folks living in poverty. There's an approach that I've seen work very nicely with a change initiative that's taking place in a in an attempt to change the child welfare system in the state here in the U.S., in which they've created community teams that involve the content experts, being the court folks, the social workers, and so on and so forth. But then they also have involved the birth parents and the alumni of the foster care system. And one of the things that I'm aware of that they do, because just throwing those folks together, there's a power differential, there's an education differential, there's an expertise differential, and so what they have done is that they will bring in the birth parents and the alumni in advance of the meetings and have a day-long training with them about how do you tell your story, how do you interact with this group of folks in a way that you can be sure to be heard, and that will be a positive experience for you and for them. So that's been a way that I've seen one group overcome a challenge of helping them work together in that kind of environment.
That's wonderful. We do have a question.
Here where I am, we've got a reentry group. A reentry group working on reentry from incarceration, and we started with focus groups with people who have entered the community from incarceration, their advocates and family members, and have now done a couple of those. And one of the questions we asked was, what do the service providers need to learn, and what do you think are the best ways for them to go about learning it? And so that process basically is preparing people to come into the room together to actually be in the conversation around establishing a shared agenda.
Thanks, Kirby. Sorry to interrupt. And Krista, hopefully that answers your question. We do have another here from James Ash, and he asks, can you detail some specific mechanisms or tools used to engage know-how and know about experts together, particularly in terms of reducing power asymmetry? He finds that often context experts are paid for time, while context experts are paid for time, while the content experts are not. Tom or Russ, do you want to start us off with a response?
Yeah, and that's something we've written up some of our methods for doing that, but I'll just describe real quick. There's a website online where you can get these hexagonal shaped postits, and by the way, almost all of our working groups spend most of their time in their meetings in a large single circle, and we'll have an opening in the circle, and at one end we'll have a blank wall that's usually covered with paper, and we ask people to come up with 3 things and 3 different colors of these postits. For example, one would be resources that we could leverage or draw on as individuals. One would be opportunities that seem to be emerging, and one would be problems. So, say in poverty, what are the resources, opportunities, and problems related to poverty in Washington, D.C.? And everyone contributes as much as they can to all those things. And so we're putting together the wisdom of the group in these patterns and connecting the context expertise and the content expertise. No one at that point is up in front of the room except the facilitators who are facilitating building this map from everyone's knowledge.
Another way that could be addressed as well in terms of that power differential is that in simply the introductions of people in the group when they come together is to do an exercise in which you introduce yourself without referencing those things that we typically would reference when we do an introduction of ourselves. For example, I might say, hi, my name's Tom. I'm originally from Iowa. I grew up on a farm, yada, yada. I have 2 dogs. Instead of saying, hi, my name's Tom Klaus. I am president of my own company, yada, yada. And so by doing that, what happens is that we encounter one another initially as human beings and as individuals apart from the roles that we play, because many times it is the roles that we play and the status that we have as a result of those roles that creates the differential between the context expert and the content expert.
That's great.
Wonderful.
The other thing that I would add is working agreements for how the groups are going to work together, how individuals work together, how individuals will treat each other as a common conversation that the group reaches agreement on. And then to reinforce what Russ said, there are processes where the input from individuals is not identified with individuals but then is owned by the group. So putting sticky notes up on the wall, for example, is one way to do that. And there are others.
Perfect. We've got a comment here that Gonzalo really likes the dots activity too, Kirby, and is appreciative for the suggestion there, Tom. We've got 4 minutes to go, and I think we have a question here from Gonzalo. He says, but the differential in content people paid and context people not being paid was maybe not addressed directly. We had that question about content people being paid, whereas context experts are not, and how do we reduce that power asymmetry?
But Kirsty, one of the things that I would mention is that in the example I gave earlier, where they bring the context experts in, they actually budget to pay the context experts. Mm-hmm. And so that they not only have their expenses paid to be at the meetings, but they are actually given a stipend. They are paid in the same way that not perhaps at the same level as the content experts who may be on salary, but there is compensation that is given to them. Okay. And that is not something that we oftentimes think to budget for in these kinds of initiatives.
Right. Thank you for clarifying, Tom. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left in the webinar. I think we'll wrap up our question component at this time. Thank you to all of you who did ask a question and pass on your comments. We will be capturing this recording and sending it out in a follow-up email, which will also include the slide deck. I know a few of you have asked about that. And we'll include the contact information for all of our presenters today so that you can follow up with them directly should you have any specific questions that you didn't get to ask today. So thank you very much, Russ and Tom and Kirby, for giving us your time today and telling us about these wonderful collective impact tools that we can use in our own collective impact journeys, in our work, in community change. I'm just going to give just a quick little update on some of our upcoming events at Tamarack. Actually, Amy, if you can advance the slide. And we have a few face-to-face events happening upcoming in January. We've got a one-day workshop in Brampton on collective impact. We've got a few multi-day events coming up as well in February and in April. Evaluating collective impact is in February in Toronto, and our backbone specific workshop, Champions for Change, takes place in April. That one is run in partnership with the Collective Impact Forum, our partners at FSG. So please check out our events page for more information about those events, and as well as Paul Bourne's upcoming tour of Deepening Community for Collective Impact in Australia and New Zealand. And by all means, please we welcome your feedback on all of these calls. So please do email us at tamarackcommunity.ca and let us know how we're doing. And thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us on the call today. We'll send out the follow-up email within a few days. And have a wonderful holiday.